I am so pleased to get to know a little bit Rubén Rosario, St. Paul columnist, criminal justice columnist. His background is awesome. Rubén spent 11 years as a staff writer for the New York Daily News, mostly covering New York City police, law enforcement, organized crime, and the courts. He's covered some of the biggest and most notorious crime stories in the nation's largest city. These include subway gunman Bernard Goetz, a Bronx club arson fire that killed 86 people, numerous organized crime trials involving John Gotti and other chieftains and high-level soldiers of New York's 5 mafia crime enterprises. In Minnesota, Rubén has won many honors, including a 2000 National Council on Crime and Delinquency Award for an in-depth look at a Minnesota early intervention program that targets juvenile delinquents under 10. Rosario is a survivor of multiple myeloma, an incurable but treatable cancer. He is also treasurer for Criminal Justice Journalists, a Washington, D.C.-based national organization of crime reporters and editors. Welcome to Cannon Falls and our TRIAD.
Thank you for coming. I'm very happy to be here. As you can tell from the screen, I used to be young and had a head full of hair. No longer, but that's what happens when you get a little bit older. Anyway, I'm going to probably just concentrate 15 minutes on one particular story that I covered back home in New York City for the sake of everybody here, but particularly the young people. So let me see if I can find it here. Back in 1986, crack cocaine was pretty much taking control of many of the impoverished communities in New York City, particularly in Harlem, which has always been historically the epicenter of the African-American experience in the Northeast. At the time in 1986, I was covering the cops, the New York Police Department, and there was a suggestion that a reporter go out and kind of cover this crack cocaine epidemic from the ground level, from the trenches. And no one volunteered except for me. And so one night, accompanied by a reformed drug dealer who knew pretty much the streets of Harlem, I went out with him in search of a crack den, which is where drug addicts usually congregate to do drugs. The first 5 crack dens that we went to, I was denied entrance, even though they knew him because they thought I was a narc, which is an abbreviation for narcotics cop. And I remember one of my friends telling me, who lived up in that neighborhood, that there were more crack dens in Harlem than there were bus stops. And I didn't believe him. After that night, I believed them. The 6th crack den that we went to, and first off, that was a few moments after we bought a rock of crack cocaine on the streets. We entered a crack den, there was a gentleman maybe about 70 years old, right in front of the brownstone entrance to a basement. And he charged us $1 to get in. We go in, and I believe it was his wife, some elderly woman, and she was just sitting at the front table, and there were crack pipes, about 6 or 7 on the table. So you can rent them, again, for another $1. So we did that. I walk in, and there are people there, about 3 young men, 2 women, I would say in their 20s, and a 14-year-old girl who is unfortunately performing a sexual favor in the corner of the room to someone. So we're walking in, and then we get in a circle standing, and we start passing the pipes around. It seemed like a communal thing, kind of like a picnic, but in the worst kind of way. And then the pipe came to me. And, smoking crack cocaine at that time this time it's against the law, right? But my priority in terms of looking at the ethical dilemma that I was facing there was, I believe that in the end I would be performing more of a public service than just simply breaking the law. And so the crack pipe gets passed to me, and I do one of these things, because I'm trying to pretend that I'm taking my friend for his birthday to get him really nice and high in stone. So we're talking that kind of play acting. Pipe comes to me, and, it's not like you can say, no, I don't touch this stuff. Well, what the heck are you doing in a crack den? So I smoke it. And I was curious. I said, because some of the cops who I talked to, some of the narc cops, oh, man, this thing is devastating. If you take a toke or two, you'll be hooked for life, that kind of stuff. Well, it kind of made me dizzy and lightheaded, but it really didn't do anything for me. In the meantime, as we're talking with these other people, there's these two women there in their 20s. And it was like I had walked into a Lamaze class because both of them were pregnant. Both of them were, I remember one saying, well, when is your due date? And one of them said, well, my due date is in 4 months. And the other one said, where's your due date? Well, my due date is about 6 months. And they were talking while they were smoking crack. And it was an eye-opener for me, both in terms of looking at people not in one dimension as being, oh, Jesus, these people are just crackheads, but looking at them in 3 dimensions. Here are people that are probably dependent or dealing with drug abuse that they can't control, and at the same time, they're trying to live life and acting as if they're going to be great parents, and it really struck me. So crack pipe comes back a second time, and I do one of these. Oh, man, this is great stuff and all that. And after maybe about 20 minutes of being there, we decide to come out. And as we're coming out, there's a police car passing right by the brownstone. But I didn't have any worries, and neither did my friend, and neither did anybody inside that basement. And the reason why? Because just a week earlier, the New York Police Department commissioner forbid or prohibited any uniformed cops from making drug busts, not only in that neighborhood, but citywide. And the reason why is because there had been some corruption scandals involving uniformed police officers ripping off drug dealers at that time. Because, like these drug dealers, it's a cash business. And there were a few occasions when some corrupt cops would stop them. There'll be lots of cash in the trunk or in possession of cars, and they knew who they would stop. And, they'll report, oh, yeah, we seized $10,000 from the trunk of this guy's car. Well, there was far more than $10,000 in that trunk. Later on, it led to corruption investigations and all that. And when I got here in 1991, there was even a bigger corruption scandal in the exact same precinct, which was later called the Dirty 30 because the precinct was the 30th precinct up in Harlem. I went back and I wrote a story, and this was the front page headline, Killer Crack into the Den of Lost Souls, which was as accurate a headline as I could have thought of, but somebody else did it for me. It was spread around 2 pages, and it pretty much detailed what I just told you, but also point to the context of politicians, what they were going to do about this crack cocaine epidemic, which is really devastating these communities and these people in the community who should be the least people to be affected by something like this. A week later, the NYPD held a press conference and cited this story as the reason why they were going to form an anti-crack officer unit, specifically to deal with this particular drug epidemic. And I felt good about it at that time. Now, I would still feel good about it if only we responded back then to the way we responded now with the opioid epidemic. Because back then it was completely and exclusively top-heavy law enforcement. Whether you possessed it, whether you used it, whether you dealt with it, you're all going to jail, mandatory minimum sentences. As you know, there was a scandal, not a scandal, but quite controversy over the penalties assessed to crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, and which demographic was using powder cocaine, which was using crack cocaine, and the disparity in sentences that we're still feeling in the prison system up to this time. But I would like to have seen, yes, an anti-crack police unit, because there were some really evil people selling poison on the streets of my hometown. But I would love to have seen a criminal justice system that was able to distinguish between somebody who's an addict and somebody who's a pusher. And sometimes there's a mingling of both in many cases. But treatment, don't send this person to jail. All you're going to do is recycle them back. Maybe treatment might work. Maybe there's no alternative sentencing, something. But in any case, that was the story in 1986. And, it cycles, the drug cycles. Back then, it was crack. A decade before that, it was heroin. And now we're dealing with this opioid epidemic, which is also affecting many communities, not just in New York City, but right here in Minnesota. So I'm going to stop right now, and just anybody who has any questions about this story, about drug epidemics, how we handle it, are we doing a good job, we're not doing a good job. I'll open it up to any questions you may have, particularly the young people who I hear need to leave in a little while. But any questions? You're all stunned. I've answered everything for you. Sure, I can do that. I can do that too. John Gotti, if any of you don't know, was the head of the Gambino crime family in New York City. And he was basically called the Dapper Don. He dressed well. He was also ruthless. His second in command, Sammy the Bull Gravano, was the second commander's consigliere, was eventually the person who ratted him out and provided testimony where he admitted that he himself, on orders from Gotti, had killed 19 people, at least 19, that he could remember. But it was, and the Gambino crime family was into drugs, was into racketeering, was into union feather bedding, casino corruption, all kinds of stuff. But Sammy the Bull got 5 years for ratting on John Gotti, who went on to be convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment and sent to the Supermax, which is the high security prison in Colorado. And Sammy got 5 years, and he was he was relocated to Arizona, of all places. I don't know if he was given a new identity or not. It's kind of tough if you take a look at Sammy the Bull Gravano's face. He's not exactly the typical Arizona resident. Anyway, Sammy, in his idle time in Arizona under the Witness Protection Program, then decided to start and found and establish a highly lucrative ecstasy ring. I think it was the largest at the time in the U.S. Of course, he got busted, and now he's serving time in prison. No longer with his buddy because John Gotti died several years ago in prison. But those guys I used to bump into during the trials that were held in Brooklyn, at the federal courthouse in Brooklyn. And you would be shocked because they would be the most funniest people I've ever met in the hallways. You know, just talking about just stuff. They had a humorous sense to them. But when you went inside that court and you heard the testimony and the evidence and you looked at them, you knew that in a split second, if it was to their benefit, they would whack you without batting an eyelash. So covering the courts for 5 years and covering these kinds of trials kind of opened my eyes to not only organized crime, but just real life. Just, there are some people out there that decided to use their entrepreneurial skills to do something very illegal and to really much have no conscience in taking lives, but to justify it because that's a murder. That's the way things are done. And their motto is not family, country, God, and family. It's the other way around. It's their family first, their family second, and their family third. And there is no country and there is no God. Although they'll go to church and do all this stuff and, do that kind of stuff, which is just hypocritical to me. But in any case, organized crime I had a great time covering that. Any questions? Yes.
Our award-winning newspaper is in attendance today, and I know some of them have looked into the profession of journalism. Any advice to them that you could give them?
Well, I can't give them any advice if they want an award. They're pretty good already.
They are pretty good. As a career path, any suggestions?
Career path, yeah. Journalism is not dead. Newspapers may be on their way out. I don't know how long shelf life they're going to have, but journalism is not there. Actually, I think we needed more quality journalism now than we ever did, because there's so much misinformation out there through the internet. Anybody can become a journalist now. You can just bang something up and people think it's true. And as you've seen with some of the collusion and efforts to malign or spin one politician or another through the internet, through what they call fake news, I think quality journalism is more in need now than ever was. So I would suggest that whether it's newspapers, whether it's a blog, whether it's social media, credibility is the bread and butter of journalism. You can't get past that. I can't write something that's not true. I can write something of what people say is the truth, but then it's up to me to either balance that out or, as a columnist, I have the license to say, well, what this person did, what this person is saying is not true. But I have to back that up. And so credibility, the day that the readers will not read the Pioneer Press because they don't believe in it or they think we make things up or that kind of stuff, is the day when the newspapers are going to go down. But I've never met anyone in my profession that has deliberately lied or put misinformation deliberately out there. Have they been fed misinformation? Yeah, but then it's up to us to try our best to filter through that. So my advice is to keep doing, seek the truth, search for the truth. And, sometimes the best you can do is just report on people who say this is the truth and counterbalance that where other people say, no, this is it. But, that credibility is the bread and butter of journalism and always will be, regardless of what venue, what medium we use to either read or listen to. Yes, ma'am. Northwest Flight 410. I don't know. I was in mid-career, late 30s. I was looking to move from Manhattan, where I grew up and lived at the time. I have a house, have something a little larger than a postage stamp, front and back yard for my kid. Just to change the pace. And we were on strike at the time at the Daily News for about 6.5 months. And somebody arranged interviews with me with several papers across the country. Seattle Times, USA Today. And then the last one on that last day was it just said St. Paul. And if you know anything about New York, is you know that we are the center of the universe, right? Nothing else exists except us. So I thought St. Paul was actually, I mistook it for St. Petersburg, Florida, which is like a suburb of New York City. That's where half of the elderly people from New York go to retire. I sit down. It's a bright, bubbly managing editor there by the name of Mindy Kiernan. And she goes, what do you know about Minnesota? And I'm like, Minnesota? I look up, and now I see the banner. It says, St. Paul Pioneer Press, Minnesota's first newspaper. I go, oh, man. How do I delicately, leave? So I said, well, I only know about 2 things about Minnesota. She goes, what are they? She's very, excited. I go, the Vikings play there, right? She goes, yeah, that's our football team. What else? I go, and it's freaking cold, right? That's all I know about Minnesota. I mean, I didn't even know. I heard about the term Twin Cities, but I didn't know which Twin Cities they were. Anyway, long story short, she charmed me. We flew out here. I liked it. I mean, you know, clean, a lot of space, a lot of greenery. Of course, they flew me here in June. And I'm a big city boy. You know, I'm like, nah. I go back. She's still on the phone. Well, we'll fly your family, your daughter and your wife out here again in July. So we, you know, came out here. I think Taste of Minnesota was on. And then they hooked us up with a real estate agent. And like he said, he asked me what I was looking for. I said, well, you know, a nice house, you know, hopefully, you know, with space. Takes me out, drives me about 15 minutes to Eagan. Shows me a 2-story home with a lake in the back. I go, I can't afford this. Because back home, the houses, back home, in New Jersey and Staten Island, there were 300, 400, 500,000 for, you know, little houses. This one was huge. I go, how much does that cost? He said, oh, it's about 110,000. I said, what? And you should see my wife's face. She was like, I'm in heaven. I go back. I'm still not convinced, though I'm, you know, they're working me real good. So I asked my wife, I said, honey, what do you think? She goes, I'll do what you want to do. But her face said, you better get this freaking job. So I was going to give it 3 years. It's been 25 years. I love Minnesota. When I go back to New York and I hear people say, Minnesota, it's freaking cold, and the Vikings play there. I go, yeah, but, you know, you stay here because we don't want riffraff from New York coming here. So anyway, that's the story of how I got here. Any other questions? It's different. It's in New York, there's still elements of the Italian Cosa Nostra crime families, but they're not as powerful as they were because the prosecutors back there armed with RICO statutes just, and then the fact that once they got into the drug trafficking business, that was the beginning of the end for them because of the lengthy federal prison terms for drug dealing. And so as a result, that murder, that code of silence that we're not going to rat on each other, that went out the window. And so people started to save their own skin, and they started to go after the kingpins, and there's still elements of Asian gangs down in Chinatown. The Russian mob has reemerged, particularly in Brooklyn, where their main headquarters are, as actually more powerful. Colombian drug cartels are also pretty powerful there, but they're not as powerful as they used to be because the feds went after them really big. You know, not only for law enforcement reasons, but also for political reasons. It's really good to take down, you know, organized crime. It looks good on your resume. Giuliani built a whole career out of it. So, and yet, okay.
And, you know, how do you find, like, the priests and the people that you reach out in the homes or things like that? How do you find the material here?
It's just what I do as a columnist is I have the greatest job in the newsroom because I get to write what I want to write when I want to write it. No one has ever told me don't write this or don't write that. I cultivate sources, you know, whether it's the police chief or whether it's the janitor in the building where I work. And, you know, I took my wife's car for a brake job yesterday. And the guy who, you know, who's going to work on my car starts telling me about, you know, his health insurance woes. That's a column right there, you know, whether he I'll come back, revisit the issue when there's some debate about it. But it's talking to people, talking to all kinds of people. I respect everybody. I mean, I've interviewed vice presidents and I've interviewed killers. And I've shown respect in both cases. You know, where you think, oh, that person doesn't deserve any respect. You just treat people on the human level. You'll be surprised at how open they might be sometimes. Have I had doors slammed in my face and threats over the phone? Sure. But those are far and few between. Sometimes people call me with good stories. A lot of times I get a lot of emails or phone calls. Oh, I think this is a story or my situation, you know, has to be written up. And 9 times out of 10, no. But there's that 10th one that is the little gem that speaks to a larger truth or a larger issue. Yes, ma'am. Oh, as far as sex trafficking? Well, as you know, the Twin Cities was singled out in a federal report maybe about 5 years ago as being one of the largest metropolitan areas for child trafficking, you know, juvenile. And back in 1999, I wrote a series of columns about The Family, which was a group of male family members based in Minneapolis who ran the largest at that time juvenile prostitution ring in the country. They were basically trafficking girls as young as 13 and 14 years old to 24 states and some provinces in Canada. Until, again, 2 cops, one cop here in Minneapolis, a cop in St. Louis, banded together and built a great case against them. And it was actually prosecuted in St. Louis, which I wrote a couple of columns criticizing the U.S. attorney at the time here because apparently for one reason or another he decided that this case wasn't priority enough for them here to prosecute. St. Louis just jumped on it, and they were able to dismantle this ring and put these guys away for life. And that was back in 1999. So it's over, right? Sex trafficking is over? No. It's probably the same or gotten worse. It's a perennial problem. The oil fields, and you know, as they used to be with the gold rush or anything else, when there's a lot of money to look for and a lot of men to go looking for it, there's going to be that kind of traffic. Watch what happens with the Super Bowl when it comes here. You know, people are going to make money any way they can. And that's one of the issues that law enforcement and others are keeping an eye out before, you know, the game is played, or they're even planning it now, what they're going to be their response to that kind of sex traffic. Any other questions? Yes. Human interest. Yeah, just profiling a person whose story is inspirational, who has overcome great odds, obstacles in life. Every year I write up kids that receive college scholarships from the Optimist Club of St. Paul. These are mostly low-income kids from low-income families or the first in their generation to even attempt to go to college. Kids, you know, hard-scrabble life, you know. One kid I wrote about, her mother killed 4 of her siblings, you know. Now she's an honor student. I think she just graduated from college. A girl who probably had no idea she would ever go to college. But she was able to, you know, have a weighted GPA of over 4, worked, was her remaining siblings' caretaker because her mom was in prison, single-family home. You got great kids out there. Great kids. And whether they get into trouble early in life, we can't just close the door. There's a lot of talent, a lot of potential in every kid. That's my view. Any other questions? Yes? Well, technically, no. I went to Fordham University back in the Stone Age, the 1970s, and they didn't have a journalism department. It was called Mass Communications. I was going to be pre-med, but I flunked pre-med. And I decided, after I asked an advisor how long it would take before I can put my shingle in my private office somewhere, and he said, about 10 to 12 years. I said, I don't have that kind of passion or commitment for this. But since I was in grade school, and English is not my native language, but ever since I was in grade school, teachers told me, wow, you write really well. And it would be easy for me to cram for a midterm or cram for an essay that was due the next day. I would stay up in 4 hours, bang something up, and I would get an A for it. Because somehow it came easy for me. I don't know why. So after I flunked pre-med, I gravitated more to, communications courses, journalism courses, radio, that kind of stuff, and I guess the bug was planted there. Okay, I'll do this real quick, this presentation, but "Sweetheart, get me rewrite" is a famous slogan for, in the newspaper journalism world. But back in the day when newspapers were king, I knew a reporter who carried a gun and went on police raids. I knew another who posed as a doctor to get a dying mobster's confession. Editors who had mayors and police chiefs sweating about what was going to be printed the next day. Newspapers, particularly back in New York, the paper that I worked for had the largest circulation of any other newspaper in the country, bigger than the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times at that time, back in the 70s and 80s. And so what we wrote was powerful. If we wrote an editorial endorsing one politician over another, it swayed people. That's no longer the case for good or bad reasons.
One theme of the Republican convention last week was the alarming level of crime. That theme was central to Donald Trump's acceptance speech.
Americans watching this address tonight have seen the recent images of violence in our streets and the chaos in our communities.
That prompted this rebuttal from President Obama.
The violent crime rate in America has been lower during my presidency than any time in the last 3-4 decades.
So, why does the public perception of crime exceed the reality of the threat? Well, you could say it's a case of terrorism, actually.
Okay, that section was pretty much about the perception of crime and the reality of crime. Sometimes the perception becomes the reality. For example, this survey reports that the rate of violent victimizations has declined by 67% since 1993, and yet a YouGov poll suggests that the violent crime rate has risen over the past 2 decades. The reality, of course, that it has fallen. But you wouldn't think so, right? If you look at the TV news, if it bleeds, it leads. And so the perception distorts the reality sometimes of crime and trying. And of course, politicians use it and spin wherever they want about whether, worrying or being concerned about crime or crime rate rising is something that's going to swing them votes. Being tough on law and order or maybe soft on law, or smart on law and order. It depends what the spin is going to be. So one of the things a good journalist does is try to cut through all that and try to give you the facts, man. Sometimes that's tough because you can really spin crime stats. You can say, St. Paul's homicide rate has gone up 50% since last year. Well, St. Paul's, the average homicide crime rate is about 16 a year. Okay. So if there's another 8, it's 24. This year, my God, the world's coming to an end. Well, how about for the past 5 years? You want to take an average of that, or the past 10 years? That's when you start to put a little more context into what the crime stats mean. But you also buttress that interviewing rank and file cops, police chiefs, anybody else who's been affected by crime to get a fuller picture of it. So with that 30-second, that 1 minute, double homicide that occurred last night in that particular part of town that you don't want to go to may distort the reality of what the overall crime rate is. But like I tell everybody, if somebody burglarizes your garage and takes your bicycle or takes your tools, the crime rate is 100%. in your home. So it's how you look at it. Come on, Carl. Can you pop up? Anyway, these are the ethics of journalism, and which I abide by, always have. Don't accept tickets, gifts, or anything else from anyone or any entity you may cover. And believe me, we get all kinds of stuff, CDs. Back home, we used to get bottles of Chivas Regals from a particular public relations agency, and there's the temptation is, take it home. No, I will always give it to the editor and say, here, you have it, or give it to somebody else. It sounds kind of minutia or kind of, trivial, but I always believed in that. Actually, when you go to a news conference and they have a spread of coffee and cookies like you're having outside, I won't touch the stuff. Don't accept the lunch or anything else of value from a source, public official or anyone else, but you can pay for the meals as long as it's work-related. Best case scenario, go Dutch. If I take out the police chief for lunch, sometimes he can't pay for me. I have to pay, okay, because I don't want any appearance of conflict of interest. We don't pay anyone for stories. Never have, never will. National Enquirer, you want a story and you want to get paid, go to the National Enquirer. Don't go to the Pioneer Press. We will pay for a photograph. We prefer to be both right and first, but right trumps first anytime. The immediacy of now a 24-hour news cycle, whether it's on the online, creates a pressure to get things out there. And of course, as quick as you can, with deadline pressures, with competitions, there's that temptation to go half-cocked, and sometimes that backfires pretty much. We try to be right and first. If we can't be right, if we can't be first, I'd rather be right. Let's see what's here. Oh. Like cops, we're only as good as the information we get to dig up. That's true. The difference is that a cop has to put together evidence or stories or reports that will later be used by a prosecutor in terms of charging somebody either in a criminal complaint or later on during the trial to get ready for court. Ours is parallel. Ours is to get things right and dig up good, reliable, truthful, and credible information so we can present it to the court of public opinion or the general public. But as I mentioned before, it's not everybody is lining up to talk to a reporter or a cop sometimes, depending on the situation. So it's tough. It's, knocking on doors, making a lot of phone calls, having people hang up on you. For example, I would call, when I was covering the crime beat in New York, I would call some family of a murder victim. I would get somebody on the phone, and they'd say, why are you calling us? Well, I know what happened, condolences to your family, but in tomorrow's paper, depending on what you tell us, is either be a little brief, or I might be able to do a bigger story about what this person meant in your life, who he was or who she was. Sometimes they say, no, I'm not interested in talking, hang up. You call that same number 20 minutes later, you get a different family member. Sure, I'll tell you everything about him. And he did this, and he was an honest Jew, he was an altar boy, all that kind of stuff. So it never hurts to call again. That's my motto. I think this was the story I covered back in I think it was 86 also. This was the Happy Land Social Club fire that killed 87 people. At the time, it was the largest mass murder in modern U.S. history until the Oklahoma City bombing in 1999, I believe. And what happened here was New York City at the time, and still does, have these after-hour speakeasies, kind of modern-day version of the speakeasies back in Prohibition era. So once you have a dance club or a nightclub in New York about 2 or 3 in the morning, you go to these places. Will be open till about 5, 6 a.m., and you just keep partying. They were illegal, technically, although, there was a wink-wink. Anyways, there was a coat-check girl there, and she had a beef with her boyfriend. And her boyfriend, to get back at her, went to a local gas station, filled up a canister of gasoline, came back, splashed it on the entrance, and just lit it up. Speakeasy was a floor above. The social club was a floor above. It was crammed with young people. And guess what? The rear entrance had been padlocked because people had been coming in to burglarize the place. So they couldn't get out through the back, and now they couldn't get out through the front. 87 people died, most of them young. I got there. The bodies were literally lying on the streets, 20, 30 in a row. Others have been put in a makeshift morgue at a high school maybe about a block away. I tracked down a young girl who had been at the dance, and she barely escaped. When I interviewed her, she lived maybe about 5 blocks away. When I interviewed her, she was still dressed in a blue dress, and I remember it vividly. Her smoke had been charred. Her face was covered with smoot. And she basically told me the harrowing tale of what happened, how she escaped, who she was with. And in the course of the interview, I asked her where she had been before she went to the social club. And she said, my friends and I went to see a movie. Some of the friends who died. I said, what movie did you go see? And she said, Forbidden Dance, which was kind of, pretty ironic and drove home the point of the tragedy that happened there. And Forbidden Dance was a popular movie at the time because at the time that was the Lambada craze back in the 80s. Let's see. Okay, does anybody know about the shooting of Philando Castile in St. Anthony? Oh, well, in Falcon Heights, actually, by a St. Anthony police officer. It happened this past summer. Of course, great debate, became a national, international story. Danny Givens, Jr. was a man who I wrote about 5 years ago. And at the age of 19, he and a friend attempted to rob a VFW post in St. Paul at gunpoint. Smart man, but not smart in terms of some of his decisions. At the time, I think he was going to college and working at the airport. Why he decided to rob the VFW? Stupid mistake by a young person. He goes in there and tries to rob it, and fortunately or unfortunately, inside is Art Blakely, who is a well-loved law enforcement officer in St. Paul. I think he used to be chief of the state fairgrounds for many years. He was Ramsey County deputy sheriff. And he also knew the family of Danny Givens. But at that night, he didn't know who he was because Danny was wearing a mask. Danny fires, hits Art Blakely here in the handles, I think twice. Art returns fire, hits him a couple of times. They later find him in an alleyway, and they find the gun they used. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. In prison, he finds Jesus. Now, I'm very skeptical in people who find Jesus, particularly in prison, because they find Jesus in prison and then all of a sudden conveniently lose him 2 or 3 months later when they go back to the same environment that got them in trouble. Danny became an ordained minister behind bars. And when he came out, one of the first people to land him a job was Melvin Carter Jr., who was a longtime St. Paul cop, who also knew Danny. The person who was on his character reference, who received wrote a recommendation letter for him, his first job was none other than Art Blakely, the man he shot. Because Blakely, being a law enforcement officer, also, he's a family man. He knew the family. He knew of Danny and went to visit him during his time in prison. And they formed this really unique friendship where they would go out after they bonded again and would speak about that incident and about this unique friendship or relationship they had. Anyway, Danny, not only knew Philando Castile, but that same week, his 2-year-old first cousin's toddler was shot and killed in a drive-by shooting. So here's a man who has gone through all that, and as I write, I'm hurting, I'm grieving, I'm in pain. He kind of put a human face to people that were connected to these two incidents and how it affected him, how it affected the community of St. Paul, and it still does in many ways. This officer's name is Dave Lamba. He is a K-9 cop in St. Paul, long time K-9 cop. 6 years ago, he was in a life and death struggle with a suspect who had a couple hours earlier shot and killed another police officer by the name of Bergeron in, I believe, North St. Paul. 6 years later, as I wrote a year ago this month, is a tough time. He took the life of a man who came close to taking his. The memories and the flashback rush back into his consciousness. They may not be as painful or lingering as in other years, but they still come. So do the tears. So I wrote this column about his experiences, about what it was like being in a life and death situation. And I'll leave you with two kind of highlights from that column, and you can look it up. Just Google my name and Google his name, and you can read all these columns online if you want. But two things struck me. During the weeks that he was recovering at home, he would look in the obituary section of the Pioneer Press to find out not only the identity of the person that he shot and killed, but also of family members. He was in that kind of state of mind that even though he was justifying taking that life, he didn't feel good about it. It's never good. People think that, police, they called him a hero. He felt he was anything but. Everybody else said, yeah, you did the right thing. You got another low life off the streets, those kinds of emails that you get, that I get too. He didn't feel that way. His heart went out to the person he killed and to his family members. A year later, he's working security at Walmart, Midway section of St. Paul. And a young woman comes up to him and says, "Are you Dave Lambert?" And he said, "Yes." He says, "I'm the sister of the man you killed." And he kind of paused, and he said, "I'm going to go and get," I told her, he tells me this, he goes, and I stopped there, I said, "Could you wait a minute here?" I said, "Where'd you go?" I said, "I went to get a box of Kleenex." I said, "Well, why?" "For her, right?" He said, "No, for me." And they sat down, and for the next half hour, he explained in blow-by-blow detail how he took this man, her brother's life. And at the end, though she still had some mixed feelings about it, she understood, and they both embraced. And to me, that's the human interest kind of story that I'd like to do. So in one column, I write about a guy who's one of the leading members of Black Lives Matters, who humanizes for people what he's going through. Another column, I humanize a police officer. I humanize what he's gone through. And it's both good. They're both stories. They're both, wherever your feelings are one way or the other, that's the job of journalism. Love me, respect me, love me or hate me, but respect me in the morning. And that's the job of journalism, whether people like it or not. Thank you very much for your time, and it's been a pleasure to come down here in Cannon Falls. It's the kind of little town that maybe one day this big city boy may retire to, if you'll have me. Thank you.